I have started a recording of the session. So everybody just be aware that we are recording the session. And then we will be making the recording available to people who could not attend. If I can just jump straight into it, maybe just first an introduction for those of you who don't know me. My name is Robbie Lowe. I'm with a company called Prometheum Carbon, and Prometheum has, in conjunction with Food and Trees for Africa, been developing the Inclusive Carbon Standard. We started the work in 2017. I think many of you here have attended some of our previous workshops. So you've probably got a bit of background about the ICS, or Inclusive Carbon Standard, already. And then we also have Chris from Food and Trees for Africa online, and we've got Simone in the office here. So yeah, just welcome to everybody. If I can just dig right into it. First of all, just the program that we've got for the training. There's 6 sessions in total for the training for the development of component methodologies. The first, which is today, we'll basically look at the principles, what motivated us to develop the ICS, what we're trying to achieve. Then we will talk about component methodologies, and then we will start looking at the technology platform, because fundamentally the whole ICS runs on the technology platform. The next session, which will be on Thursday, we will dig into the methodology manual, and that will really tell us, that's where we start getting practical to say what are required of the different methodologies, and how are they structured, and what the purpose is, and how by following the principles that's contained in the methodologies we can actually attain the principles of the ICS. The third session, which will be next week Tuesday, we'll start working on the ICS platform. And I do want to ask everybody who's on the call to please log on to the ICS platform and register as users, because when we get to this point, it will be very useful to actually be able to log on and to actually start working on the platform itself. Then after that, we've got 3 practical sessions in which we will work through step by step through some worked examples. The principles there would be to show both the approach to the development of the methodologies, and also to get people familiar with actual using and navigating the platform. So the first one of those 3 sessions, we will look at an example of a methodology that's been developed for additionality. The next one, we will look at a methodology for a baseline. And the last one is the monitoring methodology. It's in the monitoring methodology that we actually get into the uploading of equations and the doing of the calculation as well, and the capturing of data through the IoT. So that's just over the next 3 weeks how the program will run. The agenda for today is we will do an introduction of the ICS. There is going to be a little bit of repetition for those who've attended previous workshops, but I think it's good to just revisit the principles and talk about the principles. Then we will talk about the governance. Because I think that's important. At the end of the day, the governance is what makes the standard credible, and what will make the credits issued by the standard acceptable in the global carbon market. Then we start looking at component methodologies. Then we will look at the types of component methodologies and the requirements for them. And then we go into the technology platform. And then also the methodology development cycle. This is not a very formal presentation, so if at any point anybody's got any questions, Simone, can you pick up when we've got questions, and let us address questions as we go through it, and rather than to wait to the end and then have to page back through a whole pack of slides to get to something. Let's talk about issues as they're topical. So please, this is supposed to be a training session and it's supposed to be interactive. So please, if there's any questions, please ask them as we go on. If we start with an introduction, the ICS, or Inclusive Carbon Standard, is a new global carbon credit program designed to scale emission reduction and carbon removal projects, with the emphasis there on scale, both with respect to being able to generate more volume of credits, but also with the objective to make it possible for projects that was previously excluded from the carbon market to actually come into the market by removing barriers to carbon project implementation. The ICS ensures environmental integrity and social safeguards by providing a robust framework for project registration, validation, monitoring, and the issuance of the inclusive carbon credits. The ICS aims to promote climate action and sustainable development by removing barriers to carbon project development in the traditional standards, thereby encouraging a wide range of stakeholders to participate in the carbon market. So if we look at the scope of the ICS, first of all, the users. If you look at the ICS platform, we've got different types of users. We've got project owners. They are the people that actually invest the money, spend the operating cost, do the hard work to generate carbon credits. We've got the methodology developers or methodology owners, and that's what this workshop is about today. Then we've got accredited auditors. Without a strong auditing contingent, a carbon standard cannot achieve anything. It is absolutely fundamental in the principles of issuing carbon credits that there must be a very strong independent audit function in the system. And then we've got observers, and that relates to the transparency of what we do, so that it can stand up to scrutiny. Projects, and this is where we start getting into the principles. Those of you who've been exposed to the carbon market for a long time will know that there are significant barriers to entry for projects into the traditional carbon market. It mostly relates to size and cost, but the unique structure and the technology stack of the ICS will enable projects of all sizes, all the way from picoscale to mega projects. And I think this is important because we're talking about the development of methodologies at the moment in this workshop, and it will be very easy to create barriers to projects coming in by putting certain restrictions on the methodologies. So to keep in mind that the objective of the ICS is really to allow very small projects to come in. It will require a special kind of effort to make sure that the methodologies can be applicable in a way that it can allow small projects to come in without compromising the environmental integrity of the credits that's generated. Types of projects. We've had lots of questions about the types of projects. In principle, at a standard level, the idea is not to be restrictive and to exclude certain types of projects. Some of the other standards out there, if you start reading the documentation, they say this type of project's excluded and that type of project's excluded. We think that the eligibility of projects will depend on issues like, for instance, the additionality and the baseline selection. And we think that those decisions should not be taken at a project at a standard level, but it should rather be taken through the approval of methodologies and at the project level. So the idea to assume upfront that certain project types will be ineligible because there's a public perception out there that they are not additional anymore, we think that's the wrong approach. So when we look at the development of component methodologies, that is where the decisions will be taken on what projects can come in. Fundamentally, as long as there can be a component methodology for a certain project type approved, and with that approval, it will be in adherence to the principles of the ICS, then that project will be eligible to register under and generate carbon credits under the ICS. It doesn't mean that there's no restrictions. The restrictions is, first of all, on additionality. Additionality in the and one needs to be really careful of how you approach it with additionality, and that happens on two levels. It happens on the standard level where the fundamental principles are set, and then it happens at the level of the component methodology where those principles are articulated and implemented, and that then creates the guidance of what can happen at a project level. And then there's a very significant focus on do no significant harm, all projects will be required to do no significant harm risk screening at the registration stage. If we look at markets, the idea is that the ICS will supply credits into all markets, both the regulated or compliance market, or the unregulated or voluntary markets. With respect to the compliance markets, we have been working with the South African government since even before we started doing any development on the ICS. There is a process that's still ongoing. At the moment, the process sits in the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, the DTIC, for the approval of a framework that can be used to approve credit standards such as the ICS as a national standard in South Africa. And we hope that with the continued rollout of Article 6.2 of the Paris Agreement, that some other countries may also include emission reductions that happen in the voluntary markets to be included in the Article 6.2 mechanisms, and therefore it can go in there. In the voluntary markets, we're very sure that the ICS credits will be providing very good quality carbon credits into those markets. If we can move on to the rationale for a new standard. Some of you may have seen this in some of the previous workshops that we had. If we look at the graphic on the right-hand side, traditional carbon schemes, like for instance the CDM, had a very, very high risk of erroneous exclusion of carbon projects. There are many, many carbon projects that are very good emission reduction projects that has been excluded from the CDM. And simultaneously, it's got a very low risk of inclusion, of erroneous inclusion of projects. The amount of work, the amount of administrative burden you've got to prove that your project can actually be a CDM project is very, very high. And the probability that the project included in the CDM will issue credits that should not have been issued, that probability is very low. What we think what is much more reasonable to achieve is to have a more balanced approach. And in other words, to have both a high risk, both a low risk of erroneous exclusion and a low risk of erroneous inclusion. In other words, we should not, for the sake of conservancy, exclude projects that should not have been excluded from the system. We believe that the damage done to the global atmosphere by keeping very good projects out of schemes like the CDM is larger than what we can imagine. If we could have created in the CDM a mechanism that would have allowed for projects that to come in and to allocate carbon funds and carbon finance to such projects, we could have had a much more better contribution from the CDM to the global mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions. Elements to the new approach. So the question is, how do we reduce the barrier? How do we reduce the risk of erroneous exclusion? And the ICS has got some unique approaches. The first is the simplification of methodologies. Those of you who have worked in with standards like the CDM, you will know that some of the consolidated methodologies become incredibly complex. And when you deal with such complex methodologies, it puts a huge burden of proof on the project to prove that you've made the right methodological choices. And there's generally a very large volume of paper that you generate and a lot of information that's got to be audited by the external auditors. So by simplifying the methodologies, by saying that each methodology is basically broken up into component methodologies, and for a project to then only consider the part of the methodology that's actually relevant to that project and not having to apply a huge consolidated methodology as in the CDM, we think that that step alone will significantly reduce the burden on project registration and on the issuance of credits. And then that also reduces the drafting times for the project and the monitoring reports, like the PDD and the monitoring reports that you audit at the end of the day. Document creation is a very important part. Generally, when you look at registering a carbon project, your costs is divided into three parts. The first is to actually draft a document like a PDD. The second is to audit it, and the third is then the registration costs at the standard. What we do in the ICS is the document creation is automated. The component methodology that you write basically becomes a smart contract that runs on a platform. And when you choose that, that component methodology actually auto-generates the project design document, or in our case, we call it the project report template. So that can reduce the amount of time that you need to prepare a project very significantly, and it also leads to significant cost reductions. So you can see on the screen there, it says that the component methodology is basically when you develop a methodology, and that is what this training session is about. The methodology is converted in the background to code, and the code then runs and auto-generates the document template. The project and monitoring reports are auto-created when the data input fields resulting from the component methodologies are completed, and thereby also reduces the audit burden. The reason why we say it reduces the audit burden is that generally when an auditor approaches a document that was produced by a human being, you've got to read it, you've got to make sure that it actually reflects the requirements and the conditions of the methodology that it's based on. You've got to check it for errors. If, on the other hand, this document is generated by the actual platform, then the probability for human error in that space is significantly reduced. The next point that we think will add significantly to reducing the burden and reducing the cost of carbon project registration and carbon credit issuance is the data collection. The ICS platform can accept data directly from Internet of Things or IoT devices, which means that you don't have to go and manually enter the data. You don't have to build a spreadsheet that manually calculates it and then have auditors pore over the spreadsheet for days or weeks to try and find out if there's an error somewhere in the spreadsheet. When you develop the component methodology, you actually enter the formulas onto the platform. And once the component methodology has been audited and it's confirmed that the equations has been entered correctly, then thereafter the calculations happen automatically, and again that reduces the audit burden very sufficiently, as well as the time that it's taken to do the calculations and to write a monitoring report. And then at the end of the day, because all the formulas are entered into the system, once you've got the data in there, then the calculation of the emission reduction is automatic, and your monitoring report is produced automatic, and then again that also reduces the audit burden. I'm talking so much, I've got a feeling that somebody must ask a question somewhere. So please, can anybody in the audience just to confirm to me that there are still people and I haven't made everybody fall asleep?
Will there be a remaining auditing function?
Yes.
Like,
yeah, definitely.
And that's where the VVB training.
Yeah. I'm not sure that the microphone picked up the question in the room here. Could the people online hear?
It was a little bit fuzzy.
So the question was whether there is still room for an auditing function like a VVB. VVB is an abbreviation for a validation verification body, which are the auditors that audit VCS projects. And the answer is yes. So the initial project audit is very important and will probably be as hectic, burdensome, or involved as a CDM or a VCS project. And the reason for that is the auditor has to confirm that the project is real. It's got to confirm that the IoT device actually does read data onto the platform. You've got to make sure that somebody didn't jippo the IoT device to give you false data. So that audit function is there. And then when you go into the monitoring phase, there's two types of data. The one type of data can be automatically uploaded. So you've got an IoT device that feeds flow rates or electricity onto the platform. But there's another type of data that cannot be coming in through an instrument or an IoT device. It has to be manually entered. The platform provides for both types of data. And when you've got data that's manually entered, there will still be an auditor that says, yes, I've got to confirm that this data is correct and that it actually happens. Yeah. So you'll go through very similar type of audit than what you do currently with the old CDM projects or the current VCS or gold standard projects.
Can I ask another question?
Go for it.
In terms of the accounting of the ICCs, the inclusive carbon credits, are they going to be only included in RSA's kind of NDCs as reduction components, or is there any national accounting?
So
was that only for when it's included in, say, the offset regulations?
So we're working on two levels of acceptance or accreditation for the ICS. The first is the South African government. So before we started building the ICS, we asked National Treasury and the DMRE for a meeting. And the question we asked them was, if we build a standard, will government consider approving it in terms of what the provisions of the Carbon Tax Act? The answer was yes, but they didn't have a guide for the approval. So they then got World Bank funding to draft a framework for the approval of domestic standards. That framework has been developed, and it is currently with the Minister of the DTIC for approval. Once that's approved, then we can submit to whoever it's in at that point, the DMRE or the DTIC, to have the ICS approved as a South African standard. When that happens, then these credits will be able to trade into the South African carbon tax system, and it can be written into the NDC with respect to Article 6.2.
Then do they transfer into ITMOs or?
They can. So in order to do an ITMO, South Africa first has to have a bilateral agreement with a different country, and then it can be transferred in terms of that bilateral agreement.
Okay.
So, for instance, one of the very first bilateral agreements was between Switzerland and Ghana, and they don't even require the registration of carbon credit project. They just say this type of project that reduces by that much.
Yeah.
So, in the bilateral agreement between Switzerland and Ghana, you don't even have to register your project as a carbon credit project. So that's the first type of market. The next type of market is the voluntary market. There you don't really need any accreditation. If you want to convince Jeff Bezos to buy credits for Amazon or to offset his trips into space, if you can convince him, you can sell to him. But there is a body called the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market. They have produced a set of principles called the Core Carbon Principles, and during the last month, they've opened the process for application for approval for a carbon standard in terms of the Core Carbon Principles. And we have already started the application process. It's a fairly long process, and we're working through the details at the moment to get that accreditation. So that process is happening, and then we plan, once we've got some more time, once everything is up and running, to then also approach CORSIA, which is the International Aviation. So we'll approach them as well for accreditation. So that will open the international aviation market as well. We're very confident that the architecture of the ICS answers all of the questions of the Core Carbon Principles. The only burden or the only hurdle could be that the standard is still too young and they may want to see a bit of a track record, so it might take some time. But in the fundamental architecture, we do match all the requirements of the Core Carbon Principles.
Maybe a follow-up on that. Is there kind of a built-in structure in the ICS, for example, like a Plan Vivo or what GS4GG does, or the BCS with their CCB kind of functions as I know there's no net harm component, but is there kind of co-benefit?
Yeah, definitely.
Or is it okay.
We will get into it, but fundamentally, what you do with what you did with the CDM and probably with Article 6.4 mechanism, what you do with the VCS, not with the gold standard and Plan Vivo, is you get a carbon credit that's only a carbon credit, and then you can tag it. In the gold standard, the social party is already tagged in with the gold standard requirements, and Plan Vivo has got something similar. And we do provide for tagging in 3 dimensions in the ICS, but I think we'll get there. But fundamentally, all projects have to prove no net harm. And then on top of that, if you want a co-benefit tag or any of the other tags that we will talk about, you can do that. The difference between the ICS and the CDM or VCS, for instance, is in the ICS, it gets built into the original project design. So it's not an add-on. It gets built into the project itself.
Question.
Yes?
Please give an example of erroneous exclusion.
So let us say there is I'm thinking of an actual example now, because we had lots and lots of CDM projects that didn't register. I can't think of an actual example, so I'll give a theoretical example. So let us say, for instance, you've got a domestic biogas project. And maybe it's a good example because about 10, 12 years ago, we actually spent quite a lot of time with people who were looking at rolling out domestic biodigester. So what the project would be is the project would take domestic waste, both from the kitchen and the toilets. It goes into a biodigester, and the gas that comes out of it is used for cooking. and heating, and the digestate that goes out is a good fertilizer that can be used for food production. In countries like India, very large-scale domestic biodigester projects have registered. In South Africa, the projects were too small and they could not afford the monitoring requirements of the CDM, and those projects never registered, so there was never any finance for them because they couldn't access the carbon markets and they never rolled out. Another example is we must have had, over the last 15 years, we must have had about 10 approaches for people who wanted to do composting projects. And on every single occasion, the project didn't happen because the amount of material you've got to compost in order to pay the overheads of a carbon credit project was simply too high to make these projects viable. So a lot of these potential composting projects never came off the ground because they didn't have the scale to implement the requirements of the CDM. And therefore, those projects never happened. So if you add all of that up, then there's quite a lot of emission reduction that could have happened. Mainly what happened in the CDM is the large-scale industrial projects got implemented, and the smaller-scale projects with higher social benefit never got implemented. Any more questions?
No more questions.
Okay. Shall I move on then?
Yes.
Okay. The next slide, we talk about the ICS principles. It's a very short summary here. The first is credibility. Those words there comes from the ICROA principles for carbon offsetting. First of all, the carbon offset, it must be real. So if you say a ton of CO2 was removed, then a ton of CO2 must have been removed. It must be measurable. It must be permanent. Permanence is not so much an issue with emission reduction projects, because if there was a ton of CO2 that you didn't put into the atmosphere, then it is permanent, but permanence is a big issue with respect to carbon removal projects. It must be additional. The concept of additionality, most people know it, but fundamentally it means that you cannot get carbon credits for business as usual. The principle I normally use is to say that if you're going to plant orange trees, then you can't really get carbon credits because you're actually harvesting the oranges and it's a commercial operation to plant orange trees. But if you are going to plant spekboom in the Eastern Cape, and there's no other carbon revenue, then it is additional. So for some trees you do get carbon credits and for others you don't. Additionality is one of the most difficult aspects of the carbon market. And it is one of the areas where one has got to focus on to make sure that the credibility of the carbon is there. Independent verification is very important. So if you don't have independent verification, then you really can't claim a carbon credit. And then the uniqueness relate to things like double counting. We saw in South Africa, for instance, that people built large renewable energy plant. They sell the renewable energy to Eskom. Eskom calculates the grid emission factor and say our grid emission factor has come down because we have used zero emission electricity onto the grid. In the meantime, this renewable energy plant has registered for carbon credits and sold the carbon credits elsewhere. In other words, the carbon benefit is then double counted between the user of the carbon credit to use it to reduce emissions, and the people who buy electricity from the grid at a reduced grid emission factor. So that uniqueness also is fundamental to the integrity of the carbon credits. So the credibility part is very much what the international community requires, and that is what we are committed to. And the ICS is fundamentally structured in a way to prove and to guarantee that credibility. The flip side of the coin is not that internationally accepted, and this is slightly more unique to the ICS, but it's something that we feel strongly about, and it relates to the burden of audit. So fundamentally, if you look at a carbon credit, where a carbon credit is used, a carbon credit is used to offset an actual ton of greenhouse gas emissions somewhere else. And what we find, if we look at it, the carbon world internationally, we see that there's a huge imbalance between the burden to audit the actual emission and the burden to audit the CO2 removal or the carbon credit. And fundamentally, there is no difference between the two. Fundamentally, a ton of CO2 in the atmosphere is a ton of CO2 in the atmosphere. So we think the solution to this dilemma that we've got at the moment is that the audit burden for actual emissions should be increased. To give you an example, if a company in South Africa reports its greenhouse gas emissions to the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment through an online platform called SAGERS, which is the South Africa Greenhouse Gas Emission Reporting System, you do not have to have those emissions audited by the time you upload it, and the emissions you upload there is the emissions that you pay carbon tax on. The offset regulations require that if the DFFE does require a verification certificate from you, then you have to supply it within 60 days. But there's no actual audit requirement. On the other hand, if you want to offset it and you want to use a CDM credit, you've got to spend a huge amount of time and effort and money to actually audit that emission reduction. So in the ICS, we're trying to lighten the burden of the offset. And we think that we should be met halfway by increasing the audit burden on the actual emissions. And if those things happen at the same time, then we can get to a better balance between the administrative burden and the audit requirements for the actual emission and the offset that is used to offset that emission. So it's a big drive in the ICS to try and use the approach that we've got to component methodologies combined with the IT platform, the technology stack, to achieve this balancing of audit requirements. The reason why it's important in this discussion today is we're talking about the principles of developing the component methodologies. And again, it will definitely be possible to design audit methodologies or component methodologies with huge audit burdens. And we want the people who design the methodologies to keep in mind that the objective is to make the methodology easily applicable, easily monitorable, easily auditable, so that we can achieve this balance in audit requirements. Further on the principles, cost effectiveness, I mentioned in one of the previous workshops that if people phone me and they say, I've got a carbon credit project, I initially spent many hours with people, and later I got to a point where I say, listen, it's going to cost you R1 million. If you don't have R1 million, we're wasting each other's time. The purpose of the ICS is to get over that huge cost burden, to be able to say, there is a platform, you can go and select from a drop-down list the component methodologies that you want to apply. It will take some effort from you to understand it, to understand what the eligibility requirements for the audit methodologies is, to understand the basic principles. But fundamentally, you don't have to go and hire a company like Prometheum to write a PDD for you. If you invest the time, you get to a fair understanding, you must be able to generate these documents yourself by interacting with the component methodologies on the ICS platform. The second cost component is the auditing cost, and there I've already mentioned that by generating the documents through the using the component methodologies and by capturing data from IoT devices, we believe that the auditing cost should reduce fairly significantly. Auditors are a big issue. If you're used to the CDM, VCS, or gold standard, you'll know that it costs a lot of money to fly auditors in from Europe or India or wherever, whatever auditors you use. The idea here is to use any auditor that complies with two requirements. The first is ISO 14065 accredited by an institution such as SANAS. And then they must also complete ICS training so that they know their way around the online platform. As a transitional measure, we will also accept auditors that is accredited by a standard such as the CDM. In other words, they can be a DOE or designated operational entity under the CDM, or a VVB under the VCS or the gold standard. So by using these existing audit capabilities of ISO 14065, auditors, we think that we will be able to further reduce the auditing cost. And then simplification of the project registration process through the simplification of methodologies, the automatic document generation, IoT data collection, and then linkages between this and the and other standards. Alignment with best practice. So the aim is for the ICS to get recognition and certification by best practice from the following. The first is the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Markets, or ICVCM. I've already mentioned that we have started the process to upload the documents to the ICVCM to ask for their approval. There's CORSIA, the Carbon Offset Reduction Scheme for International Aviation. I've also mentioned that once we are up and running, the idea is to approach them as well. And the South African government, I've already mentioned as well. And then we do hope that other government schemes will also eventually come in so that we can expand the market. On the markets, one of the types of tags that we make provision for is a tag to tag for markets, but we will get to that a little bit later. A further alignment with best practice, we spoke about additionality, and here we're basically just matching what is expected globally. In other words, that the project must surpass business as usual scenario and differ from baseline scenarios. Various additionality arguments are allowed for. For instance, we can make provision for automatic additionality. This is especially important for very small scale projects. You'll find in many of the existing standards that, for instance, projects that are implemented in rural households are deemed to be automatically additional. That's typically done on a positive list. Investment analysis, that's fairly standard practice. Probably about 80% of all carbon projects registered to date globally has been registered using an investment analysis as a additionality to prove additionality. There's also provision for barrier analysis, and then also project-specific baselines, and also a thing called regulatory excess, which means that it's prohibiting credit issuance for legally mandated actions. In other words, if you have a law in a country that says that you may only fit LED lamps, for instance, you can't get carbon credits for fitting LED lamps. So if there is a law that says, like for instance in South Africa, from a certain date onwards, biodegradable material to landfills will be banned. So when that happens, you can't get carbon credits for diverting organic material from landfill. Mitigation activity information. This is fairly important because it goes to the transparency of carbon credit projects. So if you log on to, for instance, CDM, VCS or Gold Standard websites, you can see all the project documentation. And in the ICS on our platform, that information will be available to members of the public, which creates that. Sorry, there's a question here.
Spark my interest on the carbon credit applicability of organic waste to landfill after a certain date. I think that the regulation says a 50% diversion. Does that mean you're able to get 50% of the credits?
I suspect so, yeah. So the thing about the ICS is at the standard level, there's no answer. So what you've got to do is we've got to develop a component methodology that says, in the context of this regulation, this is how we're going to prove additionality, and therefore for every ton of CO2 mitigated, the project will issue half a ton. That has then got to go to the Environmental Integrity Committee. They will look at it and say, yeah, okay, this matches the principles, this complies with the principles, and therefore we approve it, and then you can do it.
And if that law has come and gone and it's in place, and you have a landfill that's taking 50,000 tons a month of organic waste, despite the regulation.
There's very interesting wording in the CDM rules. The CDM rules said that you can't get carbon credits unless the law is widely not applied.
Okay, so then that's quite easy then.
No, but so I'm mentioning that as an example. But what you'll have to do in the ICS is you'll have to make an argument and then say, because this is not widely applied, we think that, or we argue that you can still prove additionality and still have the space.
So you've got the choice to send the waste to a landfill that's not operating legally, or you divert. So I would say that's addition. And if you had done what the government had allowed you to do, you would have been contributing terribly to the
So another example is if you have got a piece of land that's got trees on it, and you're going to chop down big trees and plant small ones, you can't get carbon credits because you will actually reduce the carbon stock. But if the trees on the land at the moment are aliens, and the law says you have to chop down the aliens, what do? Those are there are a number of such
trees and then register your project.
So under the net, right? we have to remove the trees, right?
Yeah.
And so we had to. Well, we were busy with one of these ARR projects under the BCS. We have to reversals of the aliens, since it's not being used, or essentially that carbon is lost. But they have a view that stock in a more heterogeneous system will hold more carbon in the soil and the diversity in plants, so to say.
Yeah.
But then it doesn't work for a lot of systems, say like Fangos and this type of thing, because you have large scale reversals every, say, 10 or 20 years, especially if you're monitoring or if you're working for biodiversity, because it's essentially a fire-driven system or inland actually. So
we can spend 7 hours on this, but I'd like to use it to make a point.
All right.
Okay, so the point is, if you go to standards like the CDM, VCS or Gold Standard, they tend to take these decisions at the standard level and say, we don't like this, or you can't do this. And they tend to then, the CDM executive board would make a ruling that says, we will not allow this type of thing, or that's excluded. What we're trying to do in the ICS is to refrain from making generalizations at the standard level that will impact on individual projects. The idea is to say, we're not going to say you can't get carbon credits for waste diversion, because there may be circumstances under which your project actually is additional. The onus is then on the project and the methodology developers to say, this is how we're going to prove that we still comply with the principles. And the principle says real, permanent, all of those things.
So if you have a project that you want to start, but the legislation has already been passed and the date for the transition period is 5 years, and you register your project during those 5 years, the legislation comes into effect after that,
Mhm.
do you lose your project?
You'll have to make that argument when you register your methodology, when you approve the methodology.
Because I mean, that is very scary for a lot of waste
Yeah.
related projects. And I think it's counterintuitive.
Yeah, and I think that the type of limitations that is placed on carbon finance going to good projects has done very significant damage to planet Earth.
Because that puts the kibosh on every composting operation
Yeah.
just about.
So, but the only answer I can give you at the moment is that the way we structured the ICS is to not take decisions like that at the standard level, but to leave the door open to say, let's prove it at the methodology level.
So I mean, the Western Cape is going zero organics to landfill first,
Yeah,
and that's bylaws.
yeah. It's a long discussion.
Okay, sorry.
So I hope we haven't lost the people online. Is anybody still online? Okay, Simone says yes, they are.
Yeah, we saw
The
you,
next
Robbie.
point under the alignment with best practice is just a realistic and credible baseline. All projects are based on realistic and credible baseline as ensured by the use of the approved component methodologies for establishing baselines. And that's exactly what I think this discussion that we had now is going on. And the waste to landfill, I think, is a very, very good example. It's one thing, it's very easy for government to make a law that says you're not allowed to put any organic material into a landfill site. It's very easy for government to make a law that says that on the Mpumalanga Highveld, you're not allowed to have SO2 in the air above a certain level. But at the end of the day, if you drive there and you look at the air quality, you notice that between all of the Eskom power stations, none of them run desulfurization projects. So there are many, many, many laws that governments around the world have made that's not implemented. And it is a challenging thing, and it is something that we will have to spend a very significant amount of mental energy on when we get to establishing specifically the baseline methodologies. But I don't think we should shy away from it just because it's difficult questions. Because I do think that the exclusion of these projects could be another example of a question we had earlier about the erroneous exclusion of projects that can actually make a difference. Just because there's a law doesn't necessarily mean that they are not additional.
The law comes into effect next week, Wednesday.
Oh, are we there?
We're there. 50% diversion, garden waste.
Okay. Next point on the alignment with best practice. Okay, sorry guys, we've just had a small discussion in the office here. Alignment with best practice, monitoring, reporting and verification, or what we normally call MRV. All emission reductions must be quantified, monitored, reported and verified accurately. To achieve this, the system requires projects to employ approved component methodologies for quantifying and monitoring emission reductions. This is probably the most difficult part of the development of methodologies, because it's at this point where you start, when you upload the new component methodology, you've got to specify all your variables, you've got to formulate the equations, and all of that then gets uploaded into the system. And that then serves as the basis through which the data is then acquired, either through the IoT devices or through manual input. The permanence of emission reductions, that is more relevant to carbon removal projects, and all carbon removal projects must use a component methodology related to permanence. We've already started working on one, and it is challenging. And if you look at the existing standards, there are non-permanence tools out there that you can use. They are generally very widely applicable. But when we start digging into the detail, we find that the permanence arguments are different for something like, for instance, soil carbon as opposed to the planting of trees. Permanence in a RED project, which is fundamentally an emission reduction project, not a carbon removal project, is different from permanence on commercial farms. So there are quite a lot of complexities around permanence, yeah, we look forward to the development of these component methodologies for permanence for specific applications, for specific types of projects, and to be applied in specific commercial environments. Like, for instance, there's a big difference between communal land and private land owned by a trust and private land owned by a company. All of those things can impact significantly on proving permanence. Last slide on alignment with best practice is no double counting. Fundamentally, if you've issued a carbon credit, first of all, you can't issue 2 carbon credits for the same emission reduction. And we've got certain mechanisms built into the ICS to prevent that. And then once the credit is issued, it cannot be used more than once. And that really goes towards the use and the structure of the registry where the carbon is housed. Something that is a fairly topical, it has been fairly topical over the last 1.5 to 2 years, is also the potential of double counting between carbon and other environmental attributes, like, for instance, renewable energy certificates. Some of the other carbon standards have some provisions to prevent that, and some of them don't. But we have got some principles built in that will prevent the double counting of carbon with other environmental attributes, like renewable energy certificates. I see there's another slide of the best practice alignment. This one talks about the governance. We've got a slide a bit later on that shows the governance structure. But fundamentally, what we've done in the ICS is to structure it in a way where we separate the corporate governance, in other words, the management of the commerce and the money, from the management of the environmental integrity of the standard. We've got 2 bodies. The one is called the Board of Trustees, because the standard is housed in a not-for-profit trust. The Board of Trustees have to fulfill the legal obligations in terms of the Trust Act. They've got to make sure that the business is managed correctly, that all the money is managed correctly, and that the corporate governance is in place. And then we've got the Environmental Integrity Committee that is responsible for the approval of the component methodologies, because fundamentally that's where the environmental integrity of the standard is guaranteed. And then also with respect to project registration and the credit issuance process, they will also oversee that. In the Board of Trustees, they've got a trust deed, and the Environmental Integrity Committee has got a terms of reference. And in those documents, it's very clearly articulated that those lines cannot cross. And then we've got a registry. In order to prevent a potential conflict, we've actually outsourced the registry to a South African company that runs on international platform that is used widely internationally in financial markets. Yeah, we are confident that through this arrangement of the outsourcing of the registry to an independent party, that we can actually maintain the integrity of the ownership and the requirements for the administration of the credits and no double counting. And then, I see we've got more slides on alignment for best practice. Co-benefits, this is where we get to the tagging. So when a project developer or a project owner wants to register a project, he will basically come to the platform and all the component methodologies that have been developed will be available on the platform that has already been approved. He will select the component methodologies, and then he's also got an option to select component methodologies for tagging. We provide for 3 types of tagging. The one relates to co-benefits. For instance, you can say, my project contributes to this SDG, or my project contributes to women empowerment, or environmental protection, or biodiversity, or whatever. You can also tag a project for markets. The markets can be in 2 areas. The one is a South African market. So you can say, so we have developed a component methodology based on the requirements of the carbon offset regulations. So you can say, if I get this tag, then the buyer can know that my project has been audited, that it actually complies with the South African carbon offset regulations. Or you can have a large company, let's say, let's start at A. You've got a company called Anglo, maybe there is one out there. This large company wants to know that the project was implemented inside its value chain, because it's looking for mitigation opportunities inside its value chain. So you can then say, we write this component methodology, and if you can tick the following boxes, then we know that this project is implemented inside the value chain of this company. And that then opens the market to sell to that company, for instance.
So when I first heard tagging,
Mhm.
I thought of it in a completely different way
Yeah,
because of the waste background. If you're processing domestic waste
yeah,
and a fraction of that waste was generated by Unilever,
mhm,
and you're able to tag that portion of waste to a producer,
yeah,
I understand they can only offset up to 10% by buying credits, but
Yeah.
if you tag it to their waste,
mhm.
surely they can then get more than 10%, because you're saying
No,
they're
because-
taking waste.
Because they don't pay carbon tax. So they can offset 10% of the taxable emissions,
Yes,
but they don't pay tax on the emissions from their waste. So
Yeah.
it's not really relevant whether the credits come from their waste or not. But
if
if
you
they,
took it into energy, for example, and offset coal. So
Yeah.
you took a Magnum wrapper
yeah,
and you burnt it and you generate electricity,
Mhm.
but you know it's a Magnum, you know it comes from Unilever because you've tagged it in your process.
Mhm.
And we said they're the generator, we've now produced electricity in a renewable way.
Mhm.
We're not, we've deserved a credit for saving fossil carbon,
yeah. So
and it's tagged to the producer.
So what we've done to date, and this type of discussion is what adds value to the process. What we've done to date is we've assumed that if a project is tagged, all of the credits out of that project will be similarly tagged. But what you're saying now is you've got an RDF project.
Yeah, and I've got a big
And-
camera and it's on a conveyor belt and
And-
the AI is going 73% was generated by Robbie, 12% by
Yeah.
Philip, 3% by Fabian, and I forget your name.
So what we need to think about is if we can have a project that generates 10,000 tons of carbon, 10,000 credits, and the project owner wants to tag only 30% as being from that.
Yeah, I want to tag the credits to the generator.
Yes, I understand, and
So that
it is
generator wants to-
it is not impossible. We haven't built it into the system as it is, but it's not impossible to do it.
Yeah, I think it's doable. Cool. I
So
like that.
so we can
I'll happy to write that in the book.
we can look at that. Okay, so we're slightly off topic because we're talking about co-benefits. But that's good. This is where the value comes from.
I have also another discussion, but maybe for another time on
Okay.
on the co-benefits and carbon relation.
Okay. Just maybe very briefly, the third type, so we've got 3 types of tags. The third type of tag relates to the use of proceeds. So what we see, especially when we look at the projects that are more community orientated, is that there is a market, and this doesn't exist anywhere that we're aware of at the moment as a solution, but there is a market for somebody to say, I'm going to put clean cook stoves into a community, and I will put 50% of the carbon revenue back into that community. So you write a component methodology that says, this is how I'm going to audit it. And if it's audited, then the project, the credits coming out of it is then tagged to say that for this credit, 50% or 30% or whatever you want to put on it, of the proceeds of this carbon has actually gone to that purpose or that purpose. So that
circular.
If you extend that and say 100% of the benefit goes to the community because I've donated the stoves,
you can do that as well. So what the people do at the moment is they donate the stoves, but they keep 100% of the carbon for themselves.
Yeah.
So yeah, you can. The idea is to create a space within which people can create a market. I'm a carbon buyer, and I'm looking at you and I say, you know what? I know that you put a stove out there for, you pay 50 Rand for the stove, and you pocket 750 Rands worth of carbon every year coming out of the stove. I don't really want to really give my money to you because it doesn't really go where I think it should. But if you now say I pay 50 Rand for the stove, and of the carbon revenue, I will give 50% or 60 or 5% or 95% of the carbon back to the community that's where that stove is. As an investor can say, or as a carbon buyer can say, I'd much rather give you my money to you, who recycles the money in that way, than to you, who pockets everything. So it can create a differentiator for the credits when you put it into the market.
So I could target a local beneficial project in the neighborhood of a big generator that I wanted to be involved in the project because it's their local community.
Yeah, or if you look at the waste sector, you can say, I am going to get the carbon credits out of this project, and I'm going to take a certain, let's say 10% of the money, and I'm going to use it to further clean up the streets in that neighborhood, or any application of the anything that relates to the use of proceeds from the carbon revenue.
Got it.
You can tag it. And then the next point is do no significant harm. So we've spent a lot of time when we developed the ICS. Initially, we ended up, or we started with a phrase out of the CDM. The CDM talks about no net harm. And then we said, it doesn't help us to just have the words no net harm in there. How do you implement it? What do you do? How do you police it? How do you make sure there's no net harm? And eventually, we came across a principle in the European Union. So in the European Union, when there's any public funding going into a specific project, you have to prove, according to a very firm set of rules, that this project does no significant harm. And we felt that that is the best developed concept of this nature that we could build on. So at the project registration level, all projects in the basic project description has to do a risk analysis for do no significant harm. And that's got to be presented. So this is not a principle that comes out of the carbon world necessarily. It's a principle that came out of the European Union funding environment, but we think that it's very, very applicable in this space. So we've built that in. Cancun safeguards for REDD+ projects. This requirement was added fairly late on, and it came from a requirement that was listed by the ICVCM. On an ongoing basis, as the ICVCM published various versions of the core carbon principles, we always try to retrofit and to match the ICS requirements with the core carbon principles. And so this comes from that process. And then lastly, just the technology platform. The initial development of the platform started in 2017. In 2017, we were very caught up in the blockchain boom, and we thought we will build this on a blockchain. We actually built the first proof of concept on a blockchain called Corda. And then later on, we realized that you don't actually need a blockchain, but what we kept out of it, after we went back to a traditional database, is the concept of smart contracts. So within the blockchain space, you've got this idea of a smart contract as being a piece of code that executes automatically when certain conditions are met. And basically what happens here is each component methodology gets turned into a smart contract. Even though it runs on conventional infrastructure, the concept of a smart contract is very much, or the concept of the component methodologies is very much based on what came out of the smart contract. The other thing we took out of the blockchain space was the idea of creating a community within which all the members of the community can participate for their own benefit. And that's why the idea is, or not the idea, the roadmap, the firm plan is that, in the words of Chris, who's on the call today, we will build it and we will release it into the wild. So the ICS, over a period of a couple of years, will be spun out to stand on its own. It will be independent from the original founders. And what we are hoping to do, and that's one of the reasons why I'm grateful to see that we've got quite a lot of people in this training session today, is to create this environment, to create this ecosystem where we've got methodology developers, methodology owners, we've got the auditors, we've got the project owners, and they all come to this this ecosystem, and they all operate for their own commercial benefit. And it's worthwhile. It's a commercially viable exercise for all of them. And collectively in this ecosystem, we actually have a good outcome for planet Earth as well. So, and all of that happens on this technology platform. I said about 5 slides ago, it was the last slide on alignment with best practice, but this really is the last slide on alignment for best practice. So if there's anybody, we've had a couple of questions and discussions in the room here, but anybody online, please, somebody online, please just ask a question.
No, interview.
Aaron, Mike says you've got to ask a question.
Can you hear me, Robbie?
Sorry, Fabian, you've got a question.
With regard to, say, satellite data of, say, a project instance that one wants to implement, could that be implemented through the platform, or is that something that the developer needs to prove? Because that could be really interesting to for additionality purposes, or even monitoring in some instances. For example, rating projects, that's classically.
So we have had a when we did the first proof of concept, we actually started working on a project to use satellite data for a tree planting project. That is still in development, but there are certain constraints. So what you principles as what we're talking now, but instead of electricity meter uploading data to a specific IP address in a specific format, you would get a repository of satellite data. Like, for instance, the European Union saves their data onto AWS. So what you do is you run a set of code on AWS that puts the data in a certain format and sends it to the IP address of your component methodology, and then you're there.
Awesome. Okay, that's. So it's also then automated in a sense.
Yeah. So we for instance, we looked at a satellite network that flies the whole planet once a week. So you can almost have a carbon stock calculation once a week if you run this.
Yeah. What kind of photography do they use? Because I know there's like LiDAR and land.
So LiDAR is not really satellite based.
Yeah, that's what with the plane.
Yeah. It's a long, deep technical discussion, and we can talk about. There was a question online, I think.
It was from Aaron, but I don't think we could hear him. So I've just asked him in the chat
Okay.
if he had a question.
But not only the people who we pick on should ask questions. People should. Come on, somebody ask a question.
Robbie, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, you can hear me now. Okay, cool. How's it going? Good to hear.
Who's
Good to hear
asking?
some voices there.
Is
It's
it
Aaron
Aaron?
speaking.
Hi, Aaron.
Yeah, how's it? Robbie, I'm interested in finding out, are you guys going to be following similar route in terms of time frames around registration for projects? So, you know, registering your project within 2 years of commissioning, you know, like with how BCS and Vero did, or are you approaching that in a slightly different way? And are there also provisions allowed for any amendments or changes to projects in terms of, you know, implementing new structures or increasing size, capacity, new technology, etc.?
Yeah. So it's actually more than one question you've rolled into one. So I'll answer the easy one. So the limitation for 2 years, for instance, that you find in BCS projects relate to additionality. Basically, what you've got is in the CDM you used to have prior consideration, and the BCS it's this 2 year project period for emission reduction projects, and it's 5 years for land-based projects. The point I tried to make earlier is that I think it's inappropriate to take that type of decision on a standard level. I think that what you need to do is, if you've got a solid additionality argument, you should be able to register that project. So from an additionality perspective, when somebody develops a component methodology to prove additionality for a certain type of project operating under certain conditions, the Environmental Integrity Committee must look at it and must say, yes, this complies with our principles for proving additionality, or no, it does not. Yeah. That removes that issue of the 2 years or 5 years. There's another dimension to it, however, and that is because of the ICS where the data is actually captured on the platform. You cannot get carbon credits for any time when the project was not connected to the platform. So that, unfortunately, and it's sad, but that's how it turns out, is that you cannot retroactively go and say, by the way, I've operated this thing for the last year, I want credits for it. Because the platform will only recognize it from the date that the project is actually activated.
Officially registered on the platform, yeah.
Yeah. So there is a place where there is a challenge with respect to that. So let's say, for instance, you had a CDM project and you want to transfer the CDM project to the VCS. I mean, not to the VCS, to the ICS.
Yes. Yeah.
So what we said is, in principle, if you have registered it under the CDM, for instance, and you've proved additionality, then you can write a component methodology for additionality that says, if the project's been registered under the CDS, VCS, or gold standard, then we will assume the additionality to have been proven at that point in time. So with respect to additionality, you can transfer the project in. However, your baseline and monitoring methodologies has to be uploaded onto the ICS platform, otherwise you can't register the project. So what you find now is your CDM project, for instance, ran up to the end of December 2020, but now you can only register the project on the ICS on the 1st of July 2024. So you've lost basically 3.5 years. So what we said in that case is you can add that 3.5 years you've lost. You cannot issue credits for them, but you can add that onto the crediting period. So let's say, for instance,
Okay.
you had a crediting period that ran for another 3 years. So effectively, you're at the end of the crediting period, but you didn't earn credits now for this 3.5 years. Then you can run the 3.5 years now because it is, or you can run the 3 years now because that was the remaining crediting period that you have. So yeah, the answer went slightly wider than the 2 years.
Yeah.
But I think to summarize on the 2 years, it relates to, as far as what it relates to additionality, you have to be able to prove additionality of the project through a component methodology. But then as far as retroactive credits is concerned, unfortunately, on the ICS, you can't do it, but you can add the time that you've lost to the end of the crediting period.
Okay. And then I think, I just wanted to, and I don't know if this is the discussion that's going to happen today or in a later session, but just understanding more around the principles of additionality that the ICS has and how they compare to gold standard and, let's say, VCS.
That is in Thursday's session when we dig into the methodology manual and the principles of the individual methodologies.
Okay, cool. We'll wait for them.
Yeah, don't hold your breath. It's still fairly vague because at the end of the day, so what we do is we build much stronger on the core carbon principles than on the CDM, VCS or gold standard. Because I think the team that makes up the ICVCM, when they developed the core carbon principles, they actually did a very good job of consolidating the current knowledge and sentiment out there. So we think the core carbon principles is a very strong base to build on with respect to the additionality.
All right. Thanks, Robbie.
Maybe just a time check. Got half an hour.
Serious? Oh, we've got only half an hour left. I apologize. I've taken too long. Okay, so let's run through. The next one is governance. The principle of governance. I'm going to run fairly fast. So please stop me when there's something, because there's a bit of a repetition. So I'll go through it very fast. The principle of governance is accountability, transparency, and the quality of the credits. And this slide is the one that we have touched upon. Basically, if you look at the left-hand side of the slide, you see the Board of Trustees. If you look at the right-hand side, you see the Environmental Integrity Committee. That's supported by a technical subcommittee. You've got the standard secretariat in the middle. They take care of the day-to-day. In the old days, we would have said pushing around of paper. Now we'll say clicking of the mouse. And then both the Secretariat, the Environmental Integrity Committee, the Technical Subcommittee, methodology developers and owners, project owners, and the auditors, they all communicate through the ICS platform. That is really the point where everything gets together. And then right at the top, you see the line at the top, the separation we've made between corporate governance and the governance of environmental integrity. And that sits fundamental to the structure of the ICS. I've mentioned to you that we'll release it into the wild, to quote Chris. And this is basically just a slide that says that over time, if I just go one slide back, you've got the members' annual general meeting at the top, and the members' annual general meeting has got certain rights. They can appoint the Board of Trustees, they can appoint the Environmental Integrity Committee and the Technical Subcommittee, and they can also review and approve the terms of reference of these committees. And over time, they will that will become independent and stand on its own, so that the original founders isn't involved there anymore. The governance documents, they're all available on inclusivecarbon.org. I really want to urge everybody to go and register on the website. You don't have to register to get access to these documents. These documents are also still open for public comment. So if anybody wants to dig in, go through them, submit public comment. The public comment period closes at the end of this month. 20?
25th.
Simone is just saying on the 25th. Yeah, please have a look at it and give input if you can. If we look at the governance of the Environmental Integrity Committee, there's a couple of documents that we've built this on. First of all was the ICROA Code of Best Practice. Initially, when we started building, the ICBCM and the core carbon principles did not exist. It only came out in the last year. So initially we started building on the ICROA principles. We also considered the CORSIA eligibility criteria. Later on, the core carbon principles of the ICBCM became available. So we've gone through a couple of rounds of ensuring alignment between the ICS and the core carbon principles. And then we've also gone through an exercise for alignment with a draft framework for the approval of domestic standards of the South African government. We were asked by National Treasury in 2021 if they could use the ICS as it was at the time to pilot test this draft framework. And we agreed and we worked with them. So some changes has been made to the draft framework based on the ICS, and some changes was made to the ICS based on the draft framework. So we are confident that we've got good alignment with the draft framework. If we look at transparency, the following data will be available in the public domain. The first is the carbon standard, and all of this you can find on inclusivecarbon.org. There's the operating manuals, the methodology manual that we'll go through on Thursday, and the procedures manual. The governance, terms of reference of the meeting of members, Board of Trustees, Environmental Integrity Council, Technical Subcommittee, and the Standard Secretariat. Minutes of meetings, all of them will be on the platform. Methodologies, projects, and monitoring reports will all three of them will be available at two levels. The first is drafts for public comments, and the second is once a document has been approved or project registered or credits issued, then the final documents will also be available on the platform. And this creates the transparency that we need in order to meet the principles of the core carbon principles. Component methodologies. Yeah, I think the line second from the bottom is the most important one. The manual is in a fair amount of detail, but basically the process is the creation of the methodology information, then the qualitative inputs and input groups, in other words, description of the project, the legal requirements, stakeholder consultations, etc. Then you get to a point where you define the variables, you define the parameters, and you enter the equations for the calculations. And then for the final approval of a component methodology, there's two options. The first is that it can be approved directly by the Environmental Integrity Committee if it's a fairly simple component methodology. However, if it's complex with a lot of IoT inputs, for instance, then the Environmental Integrity Committee may require that it is audited by an accredited auditor. And we'll go into more detail on Thursday. Basically, what a component methodology is it's a recipe to make a carbon project, or when it says recipe, it should actually say bake a carbon project. The different types of component methodologies, all projects have to use the first four, at least one of the first four. It's the project details. That basically gives you a general description of the project. There's additionality, you have to prove additionality. Then there's a baseline, and the monitoring and emission reduction. So all projects have to use them. what you'll find when you log onto the system is that not all methodologies are compatible with each other. For instance, if you've got a baseline component methodology that uses a certain variable, that same variable has to be used in the monitoring and emission reduction calculation. Otherwise, you can't do your emission reduction calculation. And there is a process by which we confirm the compatibility between methodologies. So when a project owner logs on, a project developer logs on, initially he's got a drop-down list of all the project details methodologies. Once he's picked one, then the additionality methodologies are filtered based on what's compatible to the previous one. So every time you pick a component methodology at the next level, it's filtered out based on the compatibility of the different methodologies. Then all carbon removal projects and REDD+ projects must use a permanence component methodology. And then any project can use tagging component methodologies for market scope benefits or use of proceeds. So that is how that hangs together. We've already done this one. Am I going backwards now? Yeah. Shouldn't. Okay. Component methodologies. Project details, it's what it says. It gives you the details of the project. It also requires of you to do the do no significant harm risk assessment. All of that's in there. And then when we get to additionality, that's next one. That's where you prove the additionality. Baseline basically specifies the baseline of the project. And then you've got the monitoring component methodology. This is where you enter your monitoring data and where you also do the emission reduction calculation. And also if there's leakage, the leakage also comes into this component methodology. Permanence we've already spoken about, and tagging we've also already spoken about. So this is tagging for markets. I've actually already touched on it. For instance, you can tag for compliance or national markets, like for instance, the South African carbon tax system, or for voluntary markets. You can tag for them. You can tag for co-benefits on the basis of SDGs or any other co-benefit that you may wish, as long as you're prepared to write a component methodology for the tagging. And then for use of proceeds, and we have already touched this and given some examples about the use of proceeds. Requirements to develop a new component methodology is you must establish unique features not present in existing component methodologies. You must provide applicability criteria for the use of the component methodology, and then consider compatibility and dependency of other component methodologies. And again, on Thursday, we will go into more detail on this. When we get to the calculations happens automatically on the platform. When you upload the monitoring component methodology, you actually upload all the variables and the equations as well. We use a open source calculation engine called AMPL. It's a very complex acronym standing for a mathematical programming language, Niflip. So there is some requirements with respect to getting the syntax right and to formulate the equations right. So it's not something that you can do. You can't get the cleaner in the office to do this. You need somebody that can apply his mind a little bit. Then there's a certain order of creation. You define the sets, parameters, and equations. But again, we'll go into it in detail when we look at it on Thursday. Philip, I'm going to skip this part because on Thursday I think we're going to get more deep into it. But basically, it talks to the sets, parameters, variables, and the equations, which is the sequence in which you actually enter the methodology onto the platform in order so that it can create a smart contract to generate the monitoring report, the project report, and then also do the calculations. So component methodology revisions. A component methodology remains valid until one of two things happens. First of all, is the Environmental Integrity Committee may decide that there was something wrong with it and they may withdraw it, or it's replaced by another version by the owner of the methodology.
All the law changes,
Sorry?
all the law changes to invalidate. Takes
Yeah,
up the additionality.
Yeah, we can talk about it. Depends on whether the laws applied or not. A revision of methodology can be changed by one of the following. Either the Environmental Integrity Committee can request it, and this may, for instance, happen when the law changes. So the Environmental Integrity Committee can turn around and say, listen, all of a sudden there is now a law that requires you to do the following, so please revise this methodology. It can be actioned by the methodology owner. So the methodology owner can say, you know, I built this methodology using this specific instrument, but now there's a much better instrument that cost me half the price and can do 7 times more. So therefore, I want to change the methodology to accommodate this. Or it can be a request of a project owner using a specific component methodology.
So is that open the door for variation?
For a revision of the, so we don't have what in the CDM and the VCS you get post-registration changes, for instance, where people then go. I mean, one project we've got at the moment, we had an issue with the CDM executive board because we were working on revision 26 of the PDD, and they only listed revision 22 of the PDD. So this madness of revising a PDD every month is, I don't think that's right. So we need to be careful about that.
But it must allow for variation.
Yeah, it allows for variation. So you can have deviations from your approved methodology, and that you do during the generation of the monitoring report. But we will have to get Philip and Olivia involved in that discussion because I can't remember all the exact details about how we do that.
What we allow for is the copying of a component methodology. So you can create a branch in the project that you build. So both branches can have the same project description, but then you can have a version 1 and a version 2 of a monitoring methodology.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Because I mean, technology, these projects are 20 years.
Yeah.
Technology changed 20 years ago.
Yeah.
I didn't have this thing.
Yeah, but you're behind the time. Okay, yeah. So, and we'll go into more details in Thursday session and then with practical examples in sessions number 3 to 6, which will happen afterwards. Again, I think there's been some. Why is this thing going backward when I'm pushing the wrong button on the? Okay. Sorry, this is where we were before I started pushing the wrong button on my keyboard. So this workshop specifically deals with methodology development, and what we've got is this is the royalties for that's earned by the methodology owner. So you write the methodology, you go through the pain of uploading it, you go through the pain of having it approved, and then what will happen is somebody uses that methodology, and on issuance, that percentage of the credits rounded up to the nearest 1 ton of CO2 is not issued into the account of the project owner. It's actually issued into the account of the methodology owner. So the project owner will get about roughly 95% of the credits issued to him, and the methodology owners will get the balance of the credits issued to them as compensation for having developed the.
So the developers get 4% and the standard gets the 1?
No, at the moment, this is all. Does the standard get something? No, I think the standard also gets 1%.
Yeah, because that's
Yeah.
4%, add
Yeah.
1, there we
It
go
is-
back to 95%.
Yeah. This may add up to more than one. So let's say, for instance, you've got a project that has got, let's say you've got a landfill gas flaring project. So you've got two baselines. So you've got a baseline on for methane emissions from the landfill site, and you've got a baseline for grid electricity. Then what the system will do is it will calculate the emissions that relates to the methane avoidance. 1% of that goes for that baseline, and it will calculate the emissions from the electricity generation, and 1% of that will go to that baseline. So it doesn't actually add up to 2, it still stays 1% because you've used two different baseline methodologies.
So the payout comes when they register the project?
No, when they issue.
When they issue, and each time they issue?
Each time they issue, yeah. So it's evergreen. Every time a project that uses that component methodology issues, then the methodology owner gets his royalty on
In
that.
a currency of his choice, to a bank of his choosing?
No, in ICC, in the ICS register. From there, you can do what you want with it.
Then it goes into the blockchain.
No. If the project owner and the methodology owner is the same, then it goes into the same account. Basically, this is the open source or the technology stack we've got. We did go through it in one of the previous workshops, but basically, the technology stack lives on a cloud server. It runs on Ubuntu on AWS at the moment. It might change. We've got a user interface. The users, which is your methodology owners, your project owners, the Environmental Integrity Committee, and the observers, they all come in through the user interface. We've got a MySQL database. In the database, we've got companies, and each company has got users. So you can allocate certain rights to certain users. You can say some people can do everything. They can upload and approve. Other people can only upload data. Other people can only look at reports and draw reports. You've got the methodologies in the database, and that's what the part that we're talking about now. And then you've got the project section of the database that contains the project reports and the monitored data and the monitored reports. Then we've also got the AMPL mathematical solver that sits to the side that does all the calculations, the number crunching. And we've got the registry that is outsourced to an independent registry providers. And then on the project side, we've got the IoT interface where the data comes in from the projects. This, I think, gives an idea of how everything will be used. So we've got the different types of component methodologies. We've got project details, additionality, baseline, monitoring. What I've done in this slide is to mark all of the compatible methodologies green. So the white ones are not compatible. So a project owner will log on. He will pick a project details component methodology. Based on that, he will get a drop-down of additionality component methodologies. Some of them may be filtered out. At the additionality level, I don't think a lot of them are going to be. I think most of the filtering will happen between baseline and monitoring. You'll pick a baseline component methodology, pick monitoring, and maybe you'll pick a tagging component methodology. Then he presses the button, he says, I want to start a project. And those component methodologies now auto-generate the project report template, which is equivalent to the PDD in the CDM or the PD in the BCS, PDD in the gold standard. He then fills in the fields, and by the time he fills in the fields, the PDD is written, the project report is written. So you don't have people like Prometheum sitting there for weeks trying to figure out what the methodology actually means, trying to piece together the PDD. Once you've gone through this step, the document's there, it's done. And then you end up right at the bottom there where you've actually got your document. When you go into the operational phase, you've got the two types of data. You've got the monitor data. So when you then start, you say, I want to start generating my monitoring report. You click a button and it creates the template for the monitoring report. Again, that comes from the component methodologies. The component methodology is now the smart contract that creates this document. And then there are two types of data that comes in. The first is manually entered data. So it will say to you, how many trees did you actually plant? Or questions like that people count that you can't bring into an IoT device. And you've got data that came in from the IoT devices. Once you've got those two data sets in this case, it's basically entering the manual data. You press the button and it does the calculations. And then the monitoring report is auto-generated. Yeah, the auditing requirements is less. You've got the manually entered data obviously has to be audited, and then the auditors may choose to confirm IoT data from IoT devices. So you can do a spot check and say, if this meter said I've consumed 1 kilowatt hour, was it really 1 or was it 75? So they can do some spot checks and say, yes, this is fine, and then everything is fine. So you'll hopefully have a significantly reduced audit burden then in this whole process. And this whole process should then condense in time as well. It would typically take us in Prometheum about 2 months to write a monitoring report. This should now be able to, should be able to do it in a week maybe. And similarly, the audit process should be significantly reduced because the auditors doesn't have to go and check whether your spreadsheet actually uses the equations that's in the methodology, because that's given, because it's part of the system. You can't mess with it. So that will hopefully reduce the audit burden and the audit time very significantly. We've got some projects that had to issue before the close of the carbon tax season in July, and they didn't issue. So those project owners now lose a year worth of revenue because there was delays at Vera.
It would upset me.
Yeah. Overall process, users can perform the following functions on the platform. The registration of users. So again, I urge you to go and register. And also, the platform is brand new. So if you run into any snags, please, we will really appreciate input. It's a new platform. Things will go wrong. We won't be surprised if somebody calls or sends an email that says, I ran into this problem. There's always, the only IT program that doesn't have a bug in it is the one that's still in the mind of the developer. The moment you start coding, there's always errors. It's just a fact of life. So you will come across them. Please help us communicate so that we can fix it. We've got the development team on standby to fix it. So you register the user, and then there's the development and program and approval of the component methodologies. Then it's the creation of the project, validation of projects, verification of the data, and then the issuance of the credits. That's how everything fits together. Registration of users. We've now got quite a number of slides that go into the process. Are we standing for time?
5 minutes till 3.
5 minutes till 3. I'm going to run through very fast. Those of you who want to stay on, you are welcome. Those who want to drop off, I will not hold it against you. Registration of users. It's fairly straightforward. If you've ever registered on a website, you go in, you say, fill in all the things, you get an email back, click on the link, and it confirms. This is a bit more of a life cycle of the component methodology. This is what we call a swim lane representation, where you've got these horizontal lines. Each of them is a swim lane, and the methodology owner does what sits in the top lane, then the accredited auditor, then the Environmental Integrity Committee, the Secretariat, and the online platform. So basically what happens is the methodology owner creates a new methodology, he generates it on the platform, and then he submits it to the for approval on the platform. When he submits it for approval, there's two things that happens. The first is it is posted for public comment, and there is currently the first methodology is currently on the platform for public comment, so you can actually go and have a look at it. And the second is the Environmental Integrity Committee then decides whether this has to go through an audit or whether they can approve it themselves. If it goes to an audit, it goes back to the methodology owner. The methodology owner then appoints the auditor. The audit does the audit, submits a recommendation. If it doesn't require audit, then a member of the Environmental Integrity Committee actually reviews it and then approves it or recommends it for approval as well. When the Environmental Integrity Committee approves it, it gets activated on the system, and then it's available for use on the system by project owners, and the methodology owner can then earn royalties from the methodology.
But it could cost money to write that methodology. You have to bring in auditors.
Yeah, so if there is an audit requirement, then you will have to pay for the auditors. So that is it. But at the moment, there's no fees payable to the ICS itself. So it's not like Vera where they say, "No, sure, we'll read your note, but send us $5,000." And then they say no after you pay them $5,000. No, sorry, I'm just joking. The development of the component methodology. So the next couple of slides basically go through each of these blocks in detail. We will go through it on Thursday. And seeing that we've only got 3.5 minutes left now, I'm going to skip through this fairly quickly. But basically, the next couple of slides just basically takes you through all of the steps. That says this is what you do, and then it also shows you on the actual platform what it is and how you manage through the process. So we will go through this in detail on Thursday as well, and then in the last 3 sessions in the series, we will go through it practically by showing you real component methodologies, how we create, how we upload, and get everybody familiar with the system and with the online platform.
When I went to the sushi course,
Yeah,
at the end,
it's like where you
I
lost
got
your finger.
yeah, I got to eat the sushi. Through the practical experience, could we write a methodology?
Yeah, you can.
Okay, good. So I get to eat my sushi.
Yeah, but don't lose your finger, please.
Fair enough.
Okay, so the next session is on Thursday. What we'll do is we will show you on the system where the manuals is, the structures, the key themes, methodology development process, component methodology design, methodology manuals, worked example. And thereafter, that was it. Did I make it in time?
You did with the minute.
The minute was clear. So anybody with any questions, please ask questions.
No questions yet.
I see there are some comments in the chat. Yeah,
Robbie, there are many questions, but we have to digest first.
Okay. The reason why we scheduled so much time and such a so we've actually scheduled the 6 sessions was I know how difficult it is to get into something new. I mean, there's a standard called the Global Carbon Council. And at one point I thought maybe I must just figure out quickly what happens in the Global Carbon Council. And even though I understand carbon fairly well, when I started digging into the website of the Global Carbon Council, I got myself lost completely. So I do believe that the best way to get people on board is to actually spend time, and so that's why we scheduled such long time, not because we want to steal time from people, but I do think that people that are seriously interested in using this opportunity to become involved and become the owners of component methodologies, we want to afford them the opportunity to get this exposure. And also, if anybody has got any questions, please call us, send emails. we don't always come back on the first day. Because we still have to pay salaries at the end of the month and keep the day-to-day business running. But we will eventually, we will prioritize it to come back and try and answer all the questions and then address all the issues. Maybe a final comment from my side is there's quite a lot of novel things in the ICS that you will not find in any other standard globally. And I assume that many of the people on the call have been exposed to carbon credits in the carbon markets for more than just a week, and maybe even a decade, maybe even more. And always when one generates something new, when you give birth to novel ideas, there's always room for improvement, there's always errors, there's always issues that we from our side maybe did not see specific angles. So contributions with respect to comments on there's a gap that can be plugged, there's an opportunity that you've missed, there's an error that you've made. Those are all very, very valuable. And just to reiterate, at the end of the day, the ICS will stand on its own. It's not a commercial venture for Promethium. It's not a commercial venture for Food and Trees for Africa. It's an ecosystem in which we hope that the ecosystem becomes viable and we can participate with everybody in the ecosystem. So, yeah, if we can get this engagement, get constructive inputs, help us to grow this faster and make it better, we'll really deeply appreciate it. I think from our side, that's it.
Okay.
Any final comments from anybody else, or can we hang up? Speak now or shut up until Thursday.
No, thanks, Robbie. It was it's a great session. I'm looking forward to the rest of them and to practically getting stuck in and getting a methodology and some projects through it.
Thank you. Okay.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody. See you on Thursday.
Bye.
Thanks, Robbie.
Bye-bye.
Cheers, and
Bye. Thank you.
thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.